Hello, everyone out there. I am absolutely thrilled to be having this conversation on Matt's new extraordinary book, The Tao of Aquinas. You might ask yourself, why get excited about an old Christian mystic, an old fogey of that old fogey church? Well, the answer is in reading this extraordinary book, Tao of Aquinas, because for many decades now, Matt has been transforming our vision of the Christian mystical tradition, aligned with his vision that has changed so many lives of the cosmic Christ and original blessing. What's very important for me is that Matt has dedicated this book to sacred activists everywhere, because he knows that at this appalling time, which we're all suffering under, the most important thing that we could do is to ground ourselves in an authentic mystical vision of the universe, one that gives us radical inspiration, radical energy, radical joy, and grounded knowledge of reality. And in Aquinas, Matt has found the Bach of Christian mystics. And this new book, which is something I've read again and again and again and shared with all of my young sacred activist friends who are thrilled with it, is one of the major sources for us of the inspiration we're going to need. So thank you so much, Matt. And how we're going to do this is that I'm going to ask Matt about his passion for Aquinas. And then I've chosen 7 chapters in this book, which I'm going to plunge into with him so that we can offer you just a taste of the great luminous feast that he's presented in Tao of Aquinas. So, dear Matt, thank you for this amazing book. Thank you for pouring out your great soul for us. Thank you for never letting up. And tell us how you first met Aquinas and why Aquinas has been so sacred and so important to you all your life.
Well, thank you, Andrew. Thank you for your encouragement over the years and your enthusiasm for this latest effort of mine and your obvious fiery response to this take on Thomas Aquinas. I actually was introduced to him when I was 15 years old in high school by a Dominican priest at my parish, because I went to public high school and many of my friends were Jewish, Protestant, or agnostic, and we'd have these great philosophical debates, and I'd go to him and he would feed me some books by Aquinas, or on Aquinas. And but of course, as a Dominican, because Aquinas was a Dominican, my training was heavily influenced by Aquinas. For example, for a course in ethics, we read Aquinas's commentary on Aristotle's Ethics and Politics. So I was quite steeped in Aquinas, but of course, as I've matured and branched out and studied other traditions, and then of course my other brother, Meister Eckhart, I've become to appreciate Aquinas even more. There's one word that comes to me when I think of Aquinas, and that is substance. He was a man of substance. He spent his whole life bringing science, and that can't be emphasized enough, science into his faith tradition. And of course, the best science of his day was Aristotle, who had 3 strikes against him. He was a pagan. He came through Islam. It was a Muslim who were translating him in Spain and in Baghdad. And he was a scientist. And at that time, the Augustinian tradition, which was dominant in Christianity, still is, was dualistic and did not think the study of nature was that important. But for Aquinas, it was everything. And he broke with the entire patristic tradition insofar as he insisted on non-dualism instead of the dualism that so tainted the Neoplatonists from Augustine to Gregory and others. It's not to say they didn't say some good things, but foundationally, they yielded to dualism as a starting point, which was a complete distortion of the biblical tradition because the Jewish tradition is not dualistic. So Aquinas was doing a radical thing, and he had the courage, the magnanimity, and the intellectual brilliance and the big heart to pull it off. Although, frankly, his path has not been the dominant path in the Christian story up to now.
Although, in many ways, the Summa Theologica is the cornerstone of Christian mystical theology, the development of the Christian church has not paid attention to what you are constantly drawing attention to in Aquinas, this non-dual celebration of the entire cosmos as the manifestation of God, and the celebration of the unity of mind, heart, body, and soul that is the key to the authentic Christ consciousness. This is what you made absolutely clear in your first great book on Aquinas, Sheer Joy. My favorite title, by the way, book of yours, Sheer Joy, which has been for years a Bible of mine, because it's not only a brilliant exposition of Thomas Aquinas, it's a marvelously original form, because it has you as Matt Fox dialoguing with Aquinas, and you've drawn all the different sources together, especially the early sources, which are thrilling beyond belief, and shown us that Aquinas is not just this amazing intellectual, brilliant being who brought together all of these traditions as you described, but himself a grand slam mystic at the level of Eckhart, at the level of Hildegard of Bingen, the two other great mystics that your life has been dedicated to bringing us into inspiration with.
Well, yes, and the title Sheer Joy that you like is, of course, straight from Aquinas, who says, sheer joy is God's, and this demands companionship. So in other words, that's his hypothesis of why the universe exists. Right. And this is a very critical question in today's science. People are asking, why does the universe exist? Is there any reason at all? And Aquinas lays it out. It exists because of joy. The divine joy requires sharing. You don't want to be joyful alone. You want to tell others about it. And that's the divine joy has birthed the universe, and we are potentially, at least, joyful creatures who are here to share the joy. And of course, that also means sharing the justice, because where there's injustice, there is unnecessary suffering and sadness. So the whole thing makes a picture.
Talking about joy, I was thinking of that great hadith when Allah says through the prophet, I was alone and longed to be loved. That's why I created the world.
Well,
that was the Taittiriya Upanishad, the greatest Upanishad.
That's marvelous.
Varuni has the son who goes into meditation, and every year he comes back from the mountain and gives his father an answer to the secret of the universe. And dad says, go back, you haven't got it yet. And eventually he gets it. And his father says, give me the truth of the universe. And he says, from the great bliss, all things have come. Through the great bliss, all things are sustained. And to the great bliss, Ananda, all things return. So this vision of the universe being created out of massive ecstatic bliss, and the whole of human life being to experience that bliss and live that bliss out in compassion and justice making, is the core vision of all of the authentic mystical traditions, and is enshrined at the heart of Aquinas in such a way that we, if we can experience it, can experience the message of Christ in a new way, so that the whole of the West can come around this vision and realize that the authentic transmission of the Christ is a transmission of joy, joy in the mind, joy in the heart, joy in the soul, joy in the body, unified with the great joy. And out of that vision can come an authentic sacred activism, which is not about blaming and shaming and torturing and demonizing others, but about expressing that joy in action to heal and transform the planet. And that, I believe, is why you dedicated this book to sacred activists everywhere. But I'd love to hear it from your own mouth.
Well, you put it wonderfully, and I love it. As you were expounding on the joy in the heart of Aquinas, I couldn't help but see that beautiful flower behind you there, so golden and emitting that same radiance
yes.
of the divine joy. Yes, wonderful painting. Yes.
Yes.
Well, each chapter of the book, and there are 32 chapters, is a sentence from Thomas Aquinas. And I think each one of them takes the top of your head off, frankly. At least it does that to me, each one of them. So the very first one is responsive to your question there. His very first chapter is, he says, the experience of God must not be restricted to the few or to the old. And I think that's extremely important today because the young have to lead, and the young are leading. Look at Greta Thunberg. Look at the Parkland High School students in Florida who really have carried the ball about gun safety in this country and so forth. The young at this time are being called to lead, and that is not a unique phenomenon. Even in the 1,500-year-old monastic rule by Saint Benedict, there's a teaching there. There's a rule that says when a really critical issue is being discussed in the community, we should call on the youngest one in the community first, because the Holy Spirit works first through them. Another way to put that is simply that the young do not have the same investment in the structures that are destroying the earth at this time. What they have an investment in is surviving, and for their children and grandchildren to survive in a healthy planet. And so they are being called, like Greta is, and not contrary to the Secretary of Treasury in America because she went to college, but because she didn't go to college. Her values are still intact. And this is how it is with the young. And so Aquinas, in this early chapter, mine, goes on about the young, how much hope they have, and how much passion they have, and how they're not yet cynical, or at least hopefully they're not, by the mistakes that adults have made and so forth. So that's part of, to me, that's why I put that statement very first up front, that chapter first, because this is a book that I want to give the young, as an elder, a handbook. Right. And this is a short book. It's a handy handbook of substance. And the substance is coming from the greatest minds and the greatest mystics of Western civilization. And why shouldn't they have this tool book in their hands when they go off to jail, or when they do the protesting, or when they do the strategizing and the educating of older ones about how we have to change our ways if we're going to survive as a species and as a healthy planet. And all these other species, they have a right to survive.
I love what you're saying. And I've just read Greta Thunberg's speeches for the 24th time, because they really are the voice of truth in our time. No one is standing up with such clarity, such savage and glorious indignation, and such purity of heart. And in her speeches, she refers several times to what she calls cathedral thinking. And by that, she means that we have to come together around this great task of healing the world over climate change with the same passion for God, the same passion for life that prompted the people to build Chartres and other things in the Middle Ages. Great cathedrals that arose out of a movement of the whole people, out of the aspiration of the whole people. It's a great phrase, and I would suggest that one of the things that's important to do is get a book like this to Greta Thunberg and the Extinction Rebellion movement, so that its tendency to get lost in blame and indignation, which is perfectly okay because they, God knows, are guilty, but also to really go on that intuition that she has of cathedral thinking, because it's that cathedral thinking that you've enshrined in this book. And it's that cathedral thinking that will give sacred activists, especially the young, groundedness in joy, groundedness in sacred energy, and the stamina, the sheer bloody stamina that they're going to need, that we're all going to need to do the work ahead. So the second thing that I outlined, because I chose 7 of your statements, I would love you to expand on number 7. Which you say, and I love this phrase because you can go on and on and on, turning it around like a diamond in your heart. Joy is the human's noblest act. And I love the word act there. So I would love to hear you on what that phrase means for you and how important it is for the young to inscribe it in letters of diamond on their heart. Joy is...
Maybe tattoos on their skin.
Tattoos, yes, tattoos. Why not?
Yes, that line from Aquinas, when I first read it years ago, it really amazed me. It really amazed me. Joy is a human's noblest act. Because it's like Rumi, it takes us beyond right and wrong. It takes you into another sphere. And of course, joy is called a gift of the spirit. And Aquinas says, joy, love is a cause of joy. Love is a cause of joy. So it's another way of talking about love. But of course, the word love has been so, what can I say, distorted in so many ways in our culture. But to go back to the joy part, and there's a wonderful teaching from the Upanishads that all creativity includes joy, and all joy includes creativity. So it's about love, it's about birthing, it's about creativity. And but to say it's our noblest act suggests, hey, why don't we build a civilization? Why don't we build our species on joy? For example, what would education be like if we really believed that joy is a human's noblest act? Why not educate one another for our noblest act? Not for just fitting into this tiny thing called the current legal system or the current religious system or the current political system, but let's blow our minds a little and reach for our nobility as a species. And just the fact that he uses that word noble is so important, that there is a nobility about our species. It's not really visible at this moment in time, but we do celebrate great hearts and souls and courage of others, from Dr. King to Jesus to Muhammad to Dorothy Day to Mother Teresa and so many. But we're all called to this nobility. But the joy is a sign of it.
It's important, isn't it, to give this as a real mission for the young, because God knows there are thousands of factors that prevent joy in our world. And God knows so much of activism isn't about joy, it's about agony and shaming and pain. Look, if we're going to shift this situation, we must have people out there who know the score, but also are prepared to live in sacred joy, because that, quite frankly, is the only way in which they'll ever attract other people to the cause. And this is essential for sacred activism, isn't it? Because sacred activism is sacred because it's grounded in the knowledge of reality, and reality is sourced and manifested by the great bliss of the Godhead. And that's why he calls it joy is the human's noblest act, because it's not enough just to be joy. That's wonderful to feel joy, but joy is naturally spilling over into action, because if you feel that joy at the possibilities of a new world, a new way of being and doing everything, you want to share the food, you want to share the feast, you want everybody to come to the great grueling party of refashioning the world in the image of compassion and justice. And from that, an activist has immense power. Look at the way Jane Goodall goes all over the world. She knows that 1 million species are on the verge of extinction, but whenever she gets up, she radiates the joy that has come to her through her relationship with animals. She radiates the joy that it gives her to serve the animals, and she radiates the possibilities that are already intact to make sure that that joy gets spread everywhere. And that's why she has had such a massive impact. And you could talk about the Dalai Lama in the same way. You could talk about Desmond Tutu in the same way.
And Joanna Macy too. Yes. Joy is a sign of the spirit, because it's bigger. It's so big, it embraces even the suffering and the disappointment and the loss and the grieving, that joy is bigger than the what can I say, the mistakes, the malfeasance that humans are capable of. And that's why we do have to embrace sacred activism with joy, because it's bigger. And without that, you can easily sink into despair, into cynicism, into not caring even, or into denial. all these are being served on the current banquet today by media and politicians. What's that?
Otherwise, if you're not living in that joy, you can easily tend to demonization of those whom you think are the criminals of the dark.
Yes.
They may be now, but if you live in joy, you have a hope of infecting them with a vaster possibility.
Yes.
That's the only way people ever change. They don't change because they're blamed. They don't change because they're shamed. They don't change because they're made guilty. They change because they see people living in the joy that their soul craves for, who are doing another holy work. And that is the only way the sacred activist movement can go forward and enchant the world into changing.
Excellent. And of course, that's what nonviolence is about. That's what King did. And that's what Gandhi and Mandela did with nonviolence. You know, that they're converting the energy, the reptilian energy of I win, you lose, of attack. They're converting it to something else. They're transforming it. They're morphing it. It's an alchemical change that can happen when joy, and you return love for anger instead of more anger for anger. But to do that, you do have to be surrounded. You have to be embraced by the reality of joy. Yeah, it goes deeper than all our brokenness.
The African American population has survived through centuries of horror. They've survived because of their passion for Jesus and their gospel music that has constantly filled them with the joy of the Spirit, that has given them the courage to survive through horrible indignity and humiliation. That's such a sign for all of us at this moment as we face the destruction of our democracy, the destruction of our environment, the growth of authoritarian governments everywhere. This is not a time for despair. This is a time to ground ourselves ever more deeper in the joy that nothing can stain and nothing can defeat, because it springs from the deathless heart of God.
And Aquinas has something specific to say about that too. He says that despair is the most dangerous of all the sins. Not the worst, injustice is the worst, he says. But when people are in despair, he says, they no longer care about themselves. Therefore, they sure don't care about anyone else. It kills compassion. And so one more reason why we have to nurture ourselves on joy in order to be the warriors, the spiritual warriors that we're called to be, the sacred activists.
Let's go on to number 3. And I love this. This is number 10. And you say, I think this is so fabulous. The same Spirit who hovered over the waters at the beginning of creation hovers over the mind of the artist at work. One of the things I've adored about your work, you know how much I love your work and how much it has been an inspiration to me and to countless others. But one of the things that's most inspired me about your work is how you constantly say that the great change that we're all trying to birth isn't going to be through activism alone. It's going to be also through mobilizing the creativity of all of the artists to inspire people, to give people the radical inspiration that they're going to need to become warrior midwives of the new reality.
Well, yes, because this is what prophets do, as Rabbi Heschel and Walter Brueggemann say. They appeal to the imagination of the people. And of course, that's what art is about. It is about awakening the imagination, whether through music, like you just alluded to, the African-American contribution, and not just the religious music, but jazz itself is a journey into the grief and a journey into joy. And it's about marrying the two. I mean, you just feel it, it's there. And of course, this is true of dance, it's true of theater, it's true of music and film. And all the great prophets were artists. Some of the greatest poetry in the world can be found in Isaiah and Jeremiah and so forth. And so it is all about imagination.
Because, and in Kabir and in Rumi, because here are great prophetic voices which are using poetry as a way to burst the barriers of religion and inflame the human heart.
Exactly. And Jesus himself chose storytelling parables as his way of talking about the divine. It wasn't by introducing 32 more commandments or thousands of canon laws. It was stories which were left for people to think about, not stories with obvious endings, but stories that awaken, again, the mind, the imagination, the conscience, raise questions, and all the rest. So here too, Aquinas, and again, Aquinas said that sentence, not me, about the how he celebrates the artist in all of us. That the same spirit who hovered over creation at the beginning, in other words, the spirit that launched this universe, the fireball 13.8 billion years ago, that spirit is alive and well in human mind and imagination. We have to tap into it. We have to dig for it. We have to work at it. It's not tiptoeing through the tulips to being an artist, because you have to carry the weight of the suffering of the time in order to go deeply into what's really happening, and then to listen for the solutions, and to invite others to listen. So all of us are creative in our way. That's our very meaning of being a human being, that we are a biped who makes things, but that the spirit is as busy today as it was 13.8 billion years ago, or at Pentecost 2,000 years ago, or at any other moment. The spirit is busy trying to get us to wake up.
And isn't it important for all the young who are sacred activists to stay creative? Because so often the work that sacred activism demands of turning up and constantly pouring yourself out in very, very difficult situations, that work, in my experience, can only be sustained by people who are constantly exploring their own creativity, as well as the creativity of the movements that they're aligned with. Many of the sacred activists I mentor, I encourage to learn an instrument, or to paint, or to write poetry, so that they can constantly find this joyful connection with their inner spirit, which will keep them going, doing the dreadful work that they're called to do.
Excellent, excellent. Yes, I call it artist meditation, the way of the prophets. And I think this has been demonstrated, as I alluded to earlier, that prophets, to nurture your prophetic soul, the warrior in you, that creativity is a primary a form of meditation, really. And that it's playful, it's bodily, always bodily, and there's joy there. But there's also the rearranging of things. It is about letting go, learning to let go, and learning to give birth. And all that, it lies at the heart. And Aquinas says, God is the artist of artists. In fact, it's my understanding in reading a lot of Aquinas that artist is his first naming of the divine. Right. That divinity is always creating. And now, of course, we know this about the universe. There's a star being born every 18 seconds. And a star, our sun, can hold 1 million Earths. So, I mean, a star is not a little tiny thing.
No.
And there's one being born every 18 seconds. I mean, how much more creative can you get than this universe of ours?
If you want to experience the creativity of God, just look at the Hubble telescope photograph.
Yeah.
You see these billion streamers of light exploding in all these amazing colors. That's what sacred activists need to nourish themselves by, but also practice in their own lives to keep going that love energy that's needed to keep the stamina alive. It's so hard to fight for justice in an inhumane, barbarian world, and that's where we are. But it's so much easier if you're connected with that creative passion within yourself.
Absolutely.
I want then to go to the next one, which is, we could go on and on because it's I love this. We ought to cherish the body and celebrate the wonderful communion of body and soul. And you know something about activists, and I've known this about myself when I've been in my most activist periods, is that it's all too easy to drop the body, to beat the body into submission, to submit the body to the dictates of conscience and the hunger to keep pouring yourself out. And that produces disastrous burnout. So when you mention this and take this great phrase of Aquinas, you're really appealing to all sacred activists. Please Please realize you're in the long haul. This is not going to change immediately. You've got to look after the whole being. Look after your mind. Keep it infused with creativity. Look after your heart. Keep it aligned with the great heart. Look after your soul by tending your soul. But look after your body, because it's your body that's going to give you the energy and the strength and the chutzpah to go on giving yourself. Giving everything, in fact.
Yes, and of course, body politic. If we cannot treat our body with gentleness, will we treat our body politic with a new vision? Because neither are being treated well in our society today. And of course, we know now how primal the real issues of our time are regarding our bodies, for the whole question of soil, healthy water, healthy air, healthy trees. I mean, all this. But another thing is that the body is a profound reminder of the cosmos. Our bodies are cosmic bodies. 60% of our atoms are hydrogen and helium that were cooked in the original fireball 13.8 billion years ago. So cosmology is not some abstraction about just looking up at the sky. It's also realizing that we are carrying the history of the universe in our bodies. Now, the other 40% of our atoms were birthed 5.5 billion years ago in a supernova explosion. Nitrogen, sulfur, magnesium, and the rest. So the point is, we are a walking cosmos. We are two-legged versions of the cosmos with a mind and a larynx to speak and to protest and to praise. And so the whole thing is bodily. And Aquinas, we can't underestimate what he suffered because he insisted on this wonderful communion of body and soul. He was condemned 3 times right after he died by bishops in Oxford, your Oxford, and Paris. And the issue was, quote, the consubstantiality of body and soul. In other words, non-dualism. He was a non-dualist in a time when the philosophical tradition from Greece was quite dualistic by way of Plato and Neoplatonism. And he chose Aristotle absolutely consciously and deliberately. He wrote 12 books on Aristotle, commenting on 12 books of Aristotle, not a single book on Plato, not a single book on Augustine. And he tells us why. Because Aristotle does not denigrate matter. And so that makes Aquinas a proto-feminist, Rosemary Luther, the great Catholic feminist theologian, says non-dualism is the real meaning, the foundational meaning. And so this is a struggle we're in today. This is something that women's wisdom and the feminist movement, and even this word that you quoted Greta about, cathedral. Cathedral comes from it means the throne. It means throne, the throne where the goddess sits.
Right.
Is the real meaning of the cathedral. And that comes from Isis. The word Isis means throne. So we're talking about bringing the feminine into consciousness again, a balance of gender consciousness. And Aquinas, surprisingly, is out front on that. Yes, he was wrong about the biology of sexuality, etc., because Aristotle had it wrong. But as a philosopher, he was laying the groundwork. He was a proto-feminist because he was a non-dualist, and he paid the price for it.
But also, it's amazing to me that they could ever have denigrated the body, since the whole meaning of Jesus is the incarnation. And Jesus radiated physical radiance as well as everything else. Otherwise, why would he have been called the bridegroom? They were all in love with him because he was a full presence of embodied love in action. And this terrible sex hatred and body hatred and misogyny and homophobia that has deeply destroyed the core of the Christ transmission. But the restoration comes through Aquinas, doesn't it? And through those who really understand at the deepest level that what Jesus is transmitting is the full sacred marriage of transcendence and immanence, heart and mind, soul and body. And what the Christ is an ensouled body and an embodied soul in unity with the whole of reality. And from that, we can do amazing things.
Exactly. And Meister Eckhart, who was the disciple of Aquinas, another Dominican, 15, 17 years old when Aquinas died, he says the soul loves the body. Whereas Augustine had said the soul makes war with the bodies. I mean, those are two different views of the world.
Right.
And of course, not only has Christianity detoured from the real meaning of incarnation, as you've described so well, but of course it detoured with the inheriting of the empire that it did in the 4th century. And so instead of Jesus' teaching of justice and love, we've had a teaching of how to support the empire in so many incarnations through history.
That support depends upon a schizophrenia, a deliberately engineered split between body and soul, which gets people to be concentrated on the so-called sins of the body and never realize the full empowerment of the Christ consciousness, which would make them rebels to authority on every level. It was a dirty, filthy plan, and it worked.
Yes, and along with it is the idea of original sin, which again was a 4th century naming that Jesus never heard of, because no Jews ever heard of it. And when Augustine came up with the word, he identifies it with our sexuality.
Right.
The original sin is our sexuality. Aquinas, I have learned, has a term, original goodness. Original goodness. And Hildegard had the term original wisdom, 100 years before Aquinas. And of course, I have the word original blessing. But all those are the same concept, you see. And that our bodies are a blessing. They're not a curse. Aquinas says our bodies don't sin. It's our choices that sin. It's our soul that sin, not our bodies. And now you mentioned the flesh.
Isn't it? The what is it? The something of the body and the sins of the spirit.
Yeah. Yes, I took, you can see how indebted I am to Aquinas. For my book on evil, which is a big book, I have it right here, in fact, is called Sins of the Spirit, Blessings of the Flesh, Transforming Evil and Soul and Society. And I get that straight from Aquinas. Aquinas says sins of the Spirit are far more serious than sins of the flesh. He says sins of the flesh take you toward God, sins of the Spirit take you away. What are sins of the Spirit? Greed, avarice, a power over others, envy, violence, and hatred, and cold heart, and so forth. Whereas that is just so interesting that Aquinas, 13th century, said that sins of the flesh take you toward God because he says they take you toward communion.
Right.
They take you toward joy. Right. You're seeking joy. Right. And it's not the end of the world. What's the end of the world is avarice and greed and power over. And the institutionalized sadism, therefore, in the sense of controlling others, control, which, of course, lies at the heart of patriarchy.
Let's go from that to the next one, which I love, and this should be written on the other tattoo. Well, I think they all should. I'm envisaging a loving army of sacred activists with tattoo.
Aquinas tattoos.
Aquinas tattoos, go for it. The vision of God is arrived at through justice. The vision of God is arrived at through justice. Yeah. And I think before we go into it, I'd just love to say that's why I have such a passion for the authentic Christian mystical tradition and for Christ himself. Because Christ is the one who said, you cannot have a complete vision of God without enacting it in justice. It gives the kingdom consciousness isn't simply seeing interdependence, which is wonderful enough. It is realizing interdependence through justice. Mm-hmm. That's been central to your life, hasn't it?
It has. And of course, I've been, I came of age during the civil rights movement, and then the women's movement and the ecology movement and the gay and lesbian movement. So, I mean, all these movements of my generation and beyond and recently are, of course, movements of justice, eco-justice, gender justice, gender preference justice, and racial justice, economic justice. So, and then the liberation theology movement from South America was awfully important to our time, and it took off right after the Second Vatican Council, of course. So you had these great prophetic theologians speaking to liberation theology. And then it was nixed, it was sat on by two popes for 34 years. And so that was a tragedy. But at least it reminded us that you cannot, in Jewish thinking, you cannot separate love from justice. Right. Hesed means the two things together. Compassion means the two things together. Eckhart says compassion means justice. That's very Jewish, it's very biblical. And it is a great gift, I think, of the West to the East, that just as the East has a lot to teach us, so this passion for justice is embedded in the whole prophetic view of the world, because you cannot have, justice is about balance. Justice is about finding the pattern that holds things together, that allows things to flourish and to thrive. To think of an ecosystem, for example. It's a web, as Hildegard said in the 12th century, there's a web of creation. And if we humans, we're part of the web, but if we rupture the web by our greed, our avarice, our forgetting of other species, she says, God will allow creation to punish humanity. We will be punished. There will be global warming. There will be the rising of seas. There will be droughts and floods and the rest. And so learning to live justly is about learning our place in the web and how we interact with other species. But a web, you know, it goes with the wind too. I mean, it's not rigid. It flows. But we have to find that flow. And so justice is an internal thing as well as an external thing, and we find it in our structures. And structures may emerge bright, shiny, and full of justice, but then over time with cultural change and with avarice and the other malicious efforts by humans, things get out of whack and off center, and then we have to fight to put them back into a place of true balance and true justice. But for Aquinas, that work of justice is finding God. Yeah. Because God is justice, he says. God is justice.
Didn't one of the great, I think it was one of the anonymous sages of the Pirkei Avot who said, justice is the holiest name of God.
Ooh.
Which is so wonderful, because it isn't peace, it isn't joy, it's justice. Because how do you tell a person who's really inflamed by God? You tell it by their passion for justice. And this is so important for the young, to link that passion that they have for justice to the sacred order of the universe. Because if they do, and they must, they'll find infinite corroboration throughout the whole of nature.
Yes, and Aquinas had this wonderful line, the saints have a heart full of justice. And the reign of God God did not call us the just to penitence, but to greater justice. So again, it's not all about penance, it's about greater justice. And in that work of justice making, there's going to be plenty of penance. There's going to be plenty of suffering. You don't have to make it up. You don't have to design it. That happens because, as Gandhi said, those with power do not relinquish it gladly or easily or quickly. So, you know, the struggle is there, but the struggle for justice is another path to the divine. Yes.
And let's end with, it pertains to magnanimity to have a great soul. You mentioned at the beginning of our talk the word nobility. And if you go around the world as we are now, you'll hardly ever hear the word noble. But for me and for you, this is the key word. In my new book, which I just finished, Radical Regeneration, which I've sent you a copy of, it ends with a plea to retrain ourselves in nobility, because we're going to need nobility. Greta Thunberg is, above all, noble. She stands there, and in her blazing youth, she says truth to power. She stands in front of the United Nations and says to them, how dare you mortgage our future? How dare you? That is the flaming out of a noble soul. And without that nobility, without that magnanimity, without us training in nobility and magnanimity, we're not going to be able to rise to the immense challenge of what we're facing. So I'd love you to speak about what magnanimity meant to Aquinas and what nobility means to you, so that we can end this in a Handelian blaze of trumpets.
Well, of course, magnanimity is two words in Latin, a great soul. So it is about growing our souls. Aquinas says, or rather Eckhart says, God is delighted to watch our souls enlarge. So we're not just here to kind of keep our souls clean and buff them up once in a while and cash them in at the end. We're here to explode. We're here to grow.
Yeah, and, like bang.
Exactly. And Aquinas says magnanimity is the expansion of the soul to great things, to do something great. And it belongs in the very notion of virtue itself. So he says that magnanimous people do not hide, that a mark of the magnanimous person is to speak and work openly and publicly diverge their words and their deeds. And he says that that truth dictates what the magnanimous person does, not popular opinion, not fear, not the fear of negative response, but truth itself. And you have that in the example you gave, of course, of Greta Thunberg. And also magnanimous people forget injuries they have suffered. They're not carrying around bitterness and not carrying around revenge on others, or they're continually opening their hearts to what's new and what's possible. And of course, magnanimity is part of courage and fortitude, he says. So when things get tough, he says, when despair is all around, that's precisely when magnanimity is called for, because it establishes a soul when the arduous arises around us. So it is about a toughness. It is about the spiritual warrior in all of us. It is about the prophet and the one who feels called to interfere. And we all should be feeling this call today. It's a time for all hands on deck. Whether you're 88 or 18, we all have a role to play in the future of this planet and the future of all these species, including our own, that are endangered. And so there's a vigor, he says, and a trust with vigor that is included with magnanimity. And he says that magnanimous people do not expose themselves to dangers for trifling things. They are not lovers of danger, but they do expose themselves to great danger for what counts, such as common welfare, justice, divine worship, and so forth, he says. I love how he puts worship, the importance of developing rituals that will gather the energy of the community so that joy does flow more readily, so that grief can be dealt with, so that imagination and creativity can flow again, and that courage may build up, so that we can be both courageous and magnanimous. So I think it's amazing, his treatment of magnanimity. And he often refers to it. So it's on his mind a lot. I think he's going around saying, where are the magnanimous people today? And what can we learn in order to imitate them? And not just today, but from history, our ancestors, who were the magnanimous ones? Jesus was magnanimous. He gave it all. And there's that great teaching, greater love than this has no person has than to lay down their life for their friends. And so it's that kind of magnanimity, I think, that is calling us, because the future generations to come are calling us and saying, okay, what were you doing in 2020 when you were told you have 10 years left to change your way as a species if we're going to survive with the planet halfway healthy? What did we all do? I think we should all meditate today on 10 years from today, and then look back to today and say, what can we give? How generous can we be? Magnanimity is about generosity, and we're not going to survive without it, not as individuals, not as communities, not as a species.
Matt, thank you so much. And for everybody who's been listening to this, how could you possibly resist? Go and buy this book and give it to people on street corners and to everybody you know, especially Republicans, because they need it. I couldn't resist that because we're going through this black farce at the moment. But the answer is in aligning ourselves with these primal truths and being brave and magnanimous enough to try and live them in our lives. And thank you for giving us all such an example over so many years. And thank you for being such a great, heroic friend to all of us in your work. And thank you so much personally for having inflamed my life with Aquinas and given me Aquinas so that I can stand here and say to everybody listening, if you can find your way to this great mystic as presented by Matt, you will find in him and in Matt's amazing commentary on him an extraordinary source of inspiration and strength and warriorhood and truth and joy. Yes.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you for your wonderful passion and truth-seeking and your sharing. How many souls you have wetted and nurtured and made green all these decades. Keep going.
I will. Thank
With
you.
Aquinas at your back and in your heart. Thank you.
Fabulous conversation. Just imagine